Hi there, folks. My name is Jordan Johnson with Condor Earth. I'm an environmental specialist and Condor's field services manager. Today, we're going to be talking about SPCC rule and how it applies to facilities like you. But first, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the committee for including Condor in this year's Central Valley Chemical Safety Day. We feel this is an excellent platform to provide the community and the industry with important and valuable information. This is my first presentation with the Chemical Safety Day. However, it's not my first rodeo when it comes to SPCC regulation. I've been with Condor for over 15 years now, which I've spent a lot of time performing site evaluations, writing plans, and for the last 5 years I've been certified as a Steel Tank Institute inspector, which helps with SPCC integrity inspections. But enough about me. You came for the information about SPCC plans.
Jordan Johnson serves as an Associate Environmental Specialist for Condor Earth. He is a Certified Steel Tank Institute SP001 Tank Inspector and a Qualified Industrial Stormwater Practitioner QISP. Jordan has 15 years of experience that includes site assessments, best management practice, effectiveness evaluation, and implementing, monitoring, and reporting programs for various regulatory-driven programs. His technical expertise includes SPCC plan development, external steel tank inspection, operation and maintenance of various sample collection equipment.
All right, so let's get into it here. As you can see from the session agenda here in front of you and from the name SPCC and me, we're going to review the applicability of the federal SPCC regulations. We're going to take a little bit deeper dive into this and figure out what drives the program and what you as a facility are going to need to do in order to comply with that if it's applicable to you. The second half, or the last portion of the presentation, we've included a bonus, and it's basically the experience that we've had with facilities, in reviewing their plans, writing their plans, regulator feedback, basically our experience from the field regarding SPCCs and their applicability. All right, before we get too far into this session, I want to define some key acronyms. It seems that the environmental compliance community thrives on acronyms, but in this case, SPCC stands for Spill Prevention, Control, and Countermeasures. The SPCC rule consists of federal regulations initially developed in 1973 for oil pollution prevention and has its roots in the Clean Water Act. Since then, it has undergone and continues to undergo amendments such as WRRDA. Don't worry, we'll revisit this one a bit later. The U.S. or Federal EPA, again, Environmental Protection Agency, has authority over this regulation. Now, if you were to open up the regulation itself, you would find that it is broken into several subparts. Subpart A is where we're going to focus our attention on, as it contains the applicability of the SPCC rule. Another key takeaway in Subpart A includes the requirement to develop and implement an SPCC plan. Those bullet points listed below provide a bit more detail of the SPCC plan's definition and purpose. So, in case you missed it, the SPCC rule is federal regulation enforced by the US EPA specifically regarding oil pollution prevention. As a brief aside on this SPCC plan topic, I've listed some of the main elements of an SPCC plan. Keep in mind, this is not an exhaustive list, and there are other elements not listed here that would also need to be considered when developing your own plan. Remember, an SPCC plan is intended to be an integral part of a facility comprehensive oil spill prevention program. Easy for me to say, right? Minimizing the potential for discharges. To accomplish this goal, the plan would need to include at least an accurate description of your facility. This goes beyond just identifying and describing oil containers at your facility. It also includes addressing the drainage paths, rain exposure, storage locations, types of activities at your site, and transfer areas, just to name a few things. While the SPCC plan is a description of the facility, it is also intended to be used as a reference document during spill response situations, emergency situations, right? So it makes sense that you would want to have a current list of facility response staff, cleanup contractors, and other local agencies at your fingertips, right? The plan should also include detailed information on how oil is stored, handled, or transferred at your site. In our experience, transfers are when spills are most likely to occur. So having safe handling procedures documented in a plan helps with spill avoidance. As far as storage is concerned, many SPCC facilities are required to adopt an industry standard for tank and equipment inspections. I mentioned earlier being a Steel Tank Institute inspector. Well, STI is one of several industry standards for the inspection and testing of oil tanks. The SPCC rule is largely performance-based, meaning that generally the facility can identify and use methods that work for them to meet the regulation requirements. So maybe STI works for them. Maybe API, the American Petroleum Institute, works for them. They have larger tanks. It depends on how your site is set up. So I could probably spend the whole session on each of these topics here, but I want to stay focused on the SPCC rule applicability. So this slide here is the crux of the SPCC rule applicability conversation. There are three criteria that need to be addressed to establish applicability. The first one listed here is probably the most straightforward to determine, and that's oil capacity. Later I'm going to show you some sources of oil at facilities that are commonly overlooked when establishing applicability, and in the next slide we'll dive into how to calculate the capacity, but for now you should know there are two thresholds, both above ground storage and underground storage thresholds. If you exceed either, then you meet condition number 1. So in other words, if you have 1,320 gallons or more of oil storage at your facility, then you meet this condition. If you have more than 42,000 gallons of underground oil storage capacity at your facility, then you also meet this condition. You should know that if the underground storage tanks used at your facility are part of another regulatory program, such as the state UST program, they wouldn't count towards your 42,000 gallon SPCC threshold. They'd be exempt. This condition, number 1, is pretty clear here. You add up all of the oil containers at your facility and come up with a total oil capacity and see if you cross the threshold. Condition 2 and condition 3 get a little more tricky and nuanced. Condition 2 deals with the agency jurisdiction at the facility. For this determination, there are 3 types of facilities: transportation related, non-transportation related, and complexes. Each of these categories has different agency oversight, and transportation facilities are covered by the Department of Transportation or the U.S. Coast Guard. Earlier I mentioned that the SPCC rule is a U.S. EPA program, so based on my comments and this slide, you might guess that non-transportation facilities are covered by the EPA, and you'd be right. Complexes are facilities that have both types of activities. Jurisdiction over equipment in these cases is determined by specific activity involving that equipment. And I think it might be easier to wrap your head around this concept if we identify some of the tasks or some of the activities that would qualify you as transportation or non-transportation. Transportation activities include onshore and offshore terminal facilities, that is, transferring to and from vessels, ships, interstate or intrastate onshore and offshore pipeline systems, highway vehicles and railroad cars used for the transport of oil, and equipment used for fueling of locomotive units. Now, non-transportation activities, or those covered by the EPA and the SPCC rule, are oil drilling and oil production facilities, oil refining and storage facilities, industrial, commercial, agricultural, and public facilities that use and store oil, waste oil treatment facilities, and loading racks. They're hoses, equipment used to transfer oil to and from highway vehicles and railroad cars. And the highway vehicles and railroad cars that we mentioned as transportation activities become non-transportation activities if they're used exclusively within the confines of the facility, like they don't leave their facility. So if your facility is covered by the non-transportation activities, then you would satisfy condition number 2. Condition number 3 is used to assess the discharge potential of a facility to waters of the U.S. or adjoining shorelines. The Clean Water Act defines the harmful discharge oil quantity as a discharge that causes a sheen or discoloration on the surface of the water. It causes a sludge or emulsion to be deposited beneath the surface of the water, or it violates an applicable water quality standard. This is referred to as the Sheen Rule. As you may have guessed, the regulation doesn't define the phrase reasonably be expected. It's up to the facility to make this determination, but you should be aware that if you determine that there is no reasonable expectation of discharge, you're going to need to provide the reasoning and documentation to an EPA inspector or the local regulator when they come asking about it. Why don't you have an SPCC? And also keep in mind that the state and local regulators can have more strict requirements for this condition. For example, in California, if your facility has a connection to the municipal storm drain system, you have a reasonable expectation of discharge to the waters of the U.S. So that's kind of the rundown of those 3 different criteria. And the way this works is if 1, 2, and 3 all apply to your facility, then you need an SPCC plan, or you have SPCC rule applicability. Earlier, I mentioned the SPCC rule amendments and making changes to the rule. I want to circle back to WRRDA, or the Water Resources Reform and Development Act. And given the information we've just covered about the capacity criteria and that the Central Valley is a big agricultural center, I want to take a second to discuss WRRDA and how it affects the SPCC rule. I think that there may be some interest out there for you guys. WRRDA includes provisions that adjusts, and I'm using air quotes on adjust, I'll explain that in a minute, but it adjusts the total oil capacity SPCC applicability criteria for farms. Now, well, the adjust or the air quotes part is that this is effectively included in the SPCC rule, but it hasn't formally been amended to the regulations. The EPA is still studying the impacts of oil storage on farms and coming to a decision on how to proceed with this. Take a look at the box below for the specific definition the EPA is using for farms in this case. Now, remember the 1,320 gallons or more threshold from the last slide. Under WRRDA, that threshold changes to 2,500 gallons or more before the SPCC rule applies to farms. That is, if you have less than 2,500 gallons, the SPCC rule doesn't apply to you as a farm. Additionally, this threshold increases to 6,000 gallons if the farm has had a clean discharge history. So the SPCC rule does not apply to farms with less than 6,000 gallons of oil capacity and a clean discharge history. Now keep in mind these adjustments have not yet been formally amended to the SPCC rule, so stay tuned. So far, we've been focused on the SPCC rule. Another acronym that I want to bring into the discussion and that you've probably heard of is APSA, or the Above Ground Petroleum Storage Act. It's a California law that became effective January 1st, 2008. Now I'm going to kind of geek out here on the history of this, but basically the law marked a change in the agency responsible for the implementation and enforcement of the state's above ground storage of petroleum statute from 1989. Under APSA, the CUPAs, or the Certified Unified Program Administrators or agencies, became the responsible agency. So no longer the Water Board, now the CUPAs. In 2013, under AB 1566, the Office of the State Fire Marshal gained oversight responsibility of APSA. So by now I'm sure you've probably been inspected at least once, probably twice, by the CUPAs. And that's because APSA requires inspection at least every 3 years for facilities with 10,000 gallons or more. Now, to be clear, the EPA still maintains implementation and enforcement authority for the federal SPCC rule. But on the state level, CAL FIRE and CUPAs also have inspection and enforcement capability through APSA. Now, as for applicability, the biggest difference between APSA and the SPCC regulations is that APSA does not regulate non-petroleum oil products, that is your vegetable oils or animal fats. These products are still covered by the federal SPCC rule though. So if you have these types of oils at your site, APSA may not be applicable to your facility, but the SPCC rule still is. We'll go into more detail about the types of oil and what that means for your facility on the next slide, but essentially, APSA requires the preparation of an SPCC plan in accordance with the SPCC rule. So In other words, you don't need to prepare a state SPCC plan for APSA and a federal SPCC plan for the SPCC rule. They're one and the same. The threshold for the APSA applicability mirrors the federal criteria of the 1,320 gallons or more of total oil capacity. But be aware, APSA was amended in 2015 to clarify tanks in an underground area, or tayugas, that may require preparation of an SPCC plan even if they have less than 1,320 gallons of oil capacity. So tanks such as your elevator hydraulic reservoirs and basement storage tanks, to name a few, may fall into this category. In these situations, the tanks could be regulated under APSA, but not under the SPCC rule. That is, they fall under the criteria or less than the criteria for the SPCC rule, but because of this area in APSA, you're required to prepare an SPCC plan. CAL FIRE has prepared a fact sheet if you're still confused for more information on tayugas, which can be downloaded from their website. Given the main emphasis of the SPCC rule is oil pollution prevention, I wanted to spend a little time on the definition of an SPCC oil. Now, the federal definition is very broad. The text of the regulation defines oil as oil of any kind or in any form, including but not limited to petroleum, fuel oil, sludge, oil refuse and oil mixed with wastes, other than dredged spoil, and oily mixtures. So natural or synthetic, petroleum or non-petroleum, fuels and grease, new oil or used oil, as far as the applicability is concerned, these are all oils that should be counted towards the facility total capacity. Now, the U.S. Coast Guard maintains a list of oils on their website, and while this is a good guide when evaluating if a substance is considered an oil, be aware that this list is not comprehensive and does not include all oils that are covered by 40 CFR 112. Now, in light of the conversation on APSA on the previous slide, I wanted to point out and really drive this home that the federal regulations include non-petroleum oils, synthetic oils, animal fats, oils, greases, and vegetable oils, whereas under APSA, if you have these kinds of non-petroleum oils at your facility, they're not counted towards your facility total, oil storage total. So now that we're familiar with what the threshold capacity is for your facility and the types of oil under the SPCC rule, let's take a look at how to calculate your total oil storage capacity. Container size is the first important factor we'll want to discuss. The SPCC rule is very clear about what to include and what not to include. Only containers that are 55 gallons or greater should be counted towards your facility total capacity. So, for example, if you look at the picture below, the tote or the boxy container on the right range from anywhere 250 gallons up to 300 or 400 gallons, depending on the size and the configuration. The drum directly to the left of the tote is a 55-gallon plastic drum. Since these containers are equal to or greater than 55 gallons, they could be included or should be included. The other drums in the far left of the picture are smaller than the ones that are 55 gallons. So it'd be safe to assume, although I hate to assume because you know what that makes you and me, but it is reasonable that these drums are smaller than 55 gallons and therefore would not be counted towards your total capacity. While totes and drums are pictured here, the same holds true for your tanks at your facility. If the tank is smaller than 55 gallons, it's not required to be considered in your SPCC plan or total capacity. The next important factor when evaluating individual storage containers is shell capacity. The same 55-gallon drum we just identified earlier that counts towards the total capacity doesn't change if we estimate that it's only half full. It still counts as 55 gallons of storage capacity. That's because the shell capacity of the drum is 55 gallons. Often in the field, I will see a tank's capacity marked at an arbitrary point less than the design capacity. Whether it's the last volume graduation mark on the side of the tank or the top of the liquid level gauge, the last reading on the gauge, it's clear that it's not the same as the shell capacity. There's still more capacity above those marks. Now, the difference between a 500-gallon tank versus a 550-gallon tank is probably not going to change the applicability picture much, but could have effects when selecting or designing secondary containment. The difference between a 4,500 gallon tank and a 5,100 gallon tank could have more significant effects on applicability and the selection of an applicable industry standard. This is one reason we like to measure the dimensions of the tank for comparison with facility information during the SPCC plan evaluation. The other scenario that I've come across is operational capacity of a tank on site and using those numbers as the tank's maximum capacity. For example, a 12,000 gallon diesel tank is only ever filled to the 10,000 gallon point, so we can consider this a 10,000 gallon tank, right? Wrong. Well, it may be a good engineering practice to partially fill a tank when calculating an SPCC capacity. The shell or maximum capacity is what should be used. I've also seen some hydraulic units with the operational capacity, or how much oil is supposed to be added while it's working, either included on the manufacturer's nameplate or added by the facility personnel for easy reference. When developing the SPCC plan, this operational capacity is not correct. You'd want to use the design capacity or the shell capacity of the reservoir when calculating the total facility storage capacity. I was unsure whether or not to add this next item on the last slide when discussing oil types, or if it was a better fit here. Ultimately, I decided that it should fit in this capacity discussion on this slide. And I'm talking about oil mixtures. This is another area of confusion for some of our clients. And here's the bottom line. Oil mixtures are considered oil under the SPCC rule. It doesn't matter if it's 5% of the container or 100%. If there's a portion of oil, then the total capacity of the container is counted towards the facility's oil storage total. This is in line with the Sheen rule that we talked about earlier as a guideline for the discharge of a harmful quantity of oil, as it doesn't take much to damage the environment. So there you have it. That's what you need to know in order to calculate a facility's total oil storage capacity. Easy, right? There are some containers and equipment that are exempt from the SPCC rule that you should be aware of. Now, I haven't included all of the exemptions, just the more common examples are listed here. And while I won't go into detail for them all, let's take a look at a few of these. Permanently closed tanks. This doesn't mean that they'll never be used again, just that a prescribed set of actions have been completed and that the tank is not in use currently. Basically, the contents have been emptied out of the tank, it's been cleaned, any of the fill ports have been closed and locked so that it doesn't inadvertently get brought back into service, but it can be brought back into service should it be needed, but it would be added to the facility storage capacity at that point, or to the SPCC plan if you have one already. USTs, I mentioned them earlier, that they shouldn't be counted as part of the capacity calculation because they're exempt. The part you need to know about these, though, is that not all underground tanks are exempt. Basically, if the UST is in the UST program, owners are already required to prevent, detect, and clean up releases. So some examples of tanks that don't fit into this UST program and would need to be included in your SPCC rule coverage are farm tanks less than 1,100 gallons, tanks in basements, tanks storing non-petroleum oils. So watch out for those guys. Motive power. This is another area that's exempt from SPCC regulation. And these are defined as onboard bulk storage containers used primarily to power the movement of a motor vehicle or onboard oil-filled operational equipment. An example would be a fuel tank on a loader at a facility. If it has a 60-gallon capacity tank, based on our 55 gallons or greater, it should be included, right? Well, these aren't considered part of the total capacity because they're exempt. Another example in the same vein would be a hydraulic reservoir for a mobile crane. Again, because it's not a fixed tank, it's part of a mobile or motive power piece of equipment. Even if it's bigger than 55 gallons for that hydraulic reservoir, it's not counted towards your SPCC rule capacity. Pesticide application and mix containers. The note on this type of equipment is that bulk storage containers for raw product before mixing, and the containers used for storing mixed product after it's mixed are regulated by the SPCC rule. So they should be included in the applicability determination. It's a very narrow subset for the mixing equipment or the mixing containers, the sprayers, those kinds of pieces of equipment are exempt, but there are pesticide containers that would still be part of the SPCC rule. Milk containers, piping and processing activities, all of those things are exempt from the SPCC rule. So it's a little bit more comprehensive in that regard for milk products. So those are just, again, a subset of all the exemptions. You can go to 40 CFR 112.1 Part D for the complete list and a little bit more information about those. Up until now, we've been talking about the SPCC rule applicability. And now I'd like to change things up and discuss what your options are once you determine that the SPCC rule applies to your facility. Qualified facilities are the first stop on this adventure. There are two categories or tiers of qualified facilities, aptly named for their Tier 1 and Tier 2. Now they both have similarities and some key differences. Let's take a look at the specifications of what each tier can do. Now, as you can see from the lists, both Tier 1 and Tier 2 qualified facilities have less than 10,000 gallons of total oil storage capacity. So if you have more than 10,000 gallons, the qualified facility options is off the table for you. Don't worry, you still have options, and I'll cover that too. The key difference between Tier 1 and Tier 2 facilities is the size of the individual containers on site. Now, a Tier 1 facility has no individual container with a capacity greater than 5,000 gallons. A Tier 2 site may have an individual container with a capacity of more than 5,000 gallons or greater. Okay, that's great, Jordan, but what does it mean if my facility is a Tier 1? Well, I'm glad you asked. A Tier 1 facility can prepare and certify their own SPCC plan. This is known as the self-certified plan. Great, right? But wait, there's more. EPA provides a template SPCC plan that's intended to streamline this process and is only available to Tier 1 facilities for a limited time. No. Well, what's the catch? Well, using the Tier 1 approach, a hybrid plan is not allowed. That is, you can't prepare parts of your plan using the template and have an engineer prepare and certify other parts of the plan. So enter the Tier 2 facility. While it is possible and might even be necessary to prepare a hybrid plan for a Tier 2 facility, there is not an EPA template option for this type of facility. The plan can be self-certified, just like its Tier 1 cousin, but the added requirement is to include an industry standard for the inspection and testing of the containers on site. In most cases, the STI standard, again an industry standard, requires formal integrity inspection of tanks 5,000 gallons and larger. So, I mean, this kind of makes sense and is in line with industry standards that are out there. So you may remember in our discussion of WRRDA that there was two different options for the total capacity, and one of them relied on a clean discharge history. And there's a similar catch within these Tier 1 and Tier 2 qualified facilities. And that's essentially, to even have this option available, you have to have a clean discharge history. And what does that exactly mean? Let's put some numbers to that. A clean discharge history means that you haven't had a single discharge of oil greater than 1,000 gallons, or you haven't had two discharges of oil greater than 42 gallons within any 12-month period. Now, if one of those two discharges is greater than 1,000, even though it's obviously greater than 42 gallons, now we are no longer a qualified facility. So keep that in mind. And when we are talking of discharges, we're talking about discharges from your site. So keep that in mind when trying to figure out if you are a qualified facility. So you're not a qualified facility. And what are your options? Well, the short answer is that you have a PE certified plan. Now, facilities that have greater than 10,000 gallons of total oil storage capacity or a less than stellar discharge history. We mentioned those, one time of 1,000-gallon discharge or more of oil and the 2 times of 42 gallons or more. Well, those facilities are no longer a qualified facility, and they have to have a PE certified plan. And it's not all bad. It also allows you the most amount of flexibility with environmental equivalence. Some of these areas that can be adjusted to accommodate your facility require a professional engineer to certify your plan. So essentially it means that you can't self-certify, that you need to have the professional engineer reviewing and certifying your SPCC plan. All right, so this is going to kind of wrap up our applicability discussion, and now we're going to move into some of the bonus content. It represents experience from the field, and these are areas of often overlooked oil sources. We've been talking about the applicability determination for the SPCC rule. Just in developing your SPCC plan properly, these are things that are overlooked, and we want to bring them into your attention and either help you create a better plan, or you can go ahead and reach out to us and we'll help develop your plan. The other category is missed activities. These are areas that often get neglected. Either they don't know about it or they don't have time for it, but these are the documentation activities that need to happen for proper implementation of your SPCC plan. So stick with me just a couple minutes longer and we'll go ahead and wrap up this session. Thanks. So the first category of overlooked sources of oil at your facility are electrical transformers. Now this picture here is just one type of transformer that you might see on site. There's smaller versions, there's larger versions, significantly larger versions. But if you find one of these on your site, the takeaway is that the ownership matters for the piece of equipment. Now if the utility company is the one that owns and operates the transformer, then it doesn't necessarily need to be included in your SPCC plan. What we've done in our plans is put a call out to the utility company saying that the facility will do their best to contain and stop the leak, and then contact the utility company to take care of the issue. Now, if the facility itself owns and operates the transformer, it's a different story. It becomes a tank that, or a piece of operational equipment that needs to be included in your SPCC plan. Hydraulic units are another category of overlooked sources of oil. These are typically equipped with oil reservoirs. In this case, or in this picture here, the box, the rectangle, that's where it's a reservoir for hydraulic oil. So these guys are really easy to kind of blend in with the surroundings if you've got a manufacturing or a production facility, and hard to spot as a AST or an oil container at your facility. I've seen all different types, a lot of them that are less than 55 gallons, up to some that are 1,000 gallons or more in terms of the hydraulic reservoir. So keep an eye out for these guys at your facility and include them in your SPCC plan as necessary. Backup generators or electrical generator units that are at your facility are also another area that are often overlooked. And in this case, or for this picture here, the black rectangle at the bottom of the unit there, that is the fuel tank. And typically these integrated or belly fuel tanks have 55 gallons or more for the fuel source of these electrical generators that sit on top of them. So the tank on the bottom would be considered a bulk storage tank, whereas the generator unit up on top is operational oil-filled equipment. Now the generators in our experience typically aren't big enough to have enough oil or fuel associated with them, that they would be oil-filled operational equipment. But these belly tanks, or the integrated fuel tanks, they often do. So a lot of times there'll be a manufacturer's plate, whether it's on the outside of the unit or if it's inside the unit somewhere, but there should be some sort of specifications on how big that tank is. If not, you can take rough measurements. Usually by opening up these doors on the side, you can gain access to where the fuel tank is located inside there. You may have mobile refuelers associated with your facility. If you do, the key to remember here is that there's going to be a tank associated with the truck itself, whether it's gasoline or diesel tank that powers the vehicle so that you can drive it around your facility. Now that tank is exempt under the motive power exemption and shouldn't be included in your capacity total. Now the tanks that are installed on the truck that are intended for servicing other vehicles, those would be included. In this case, the silver avgas tank that's installed on this truck, the capacity of that tank is included in your facility oil storage capacity. So if you do have these pieces of equipment, make sure that you're adding them to your SPCC plan or your determination. Also note that the mobile refuelers are treated just a little bit differently than, say, your fixed tanks at your facility. And that boils down to the fact that they're moving all over the site. They're never in a predictable location. And so a dedicated secondary containment system for something like that a lot of times is impractical for these. So just know that they're handled a little bit differently within your SPCC plan, and that you're adding the right tanks when you're considering your facility oil storage capacity. Let's take a look now at SPCC implementation and discuss some of the often neglected activities that we've seen in our SPCC development and evaluations. Inspections by far are the #1 category of areas that facilities are falling down. Now the forms, they either come from the SPCC template, like the Tier 1 qualified facilities that we talked about earlier, or they could be developed and provided by the engineer. They also could be part of the industry standard. The Steel Tank Institute, which I've talked about earlier, they provide monthly and annual and both fixed tank and portable tank inspection records so that you can fill those out on a routine basis. Now, while the SPCC rule doesn't specify the exact frequency that you should be inspecting these things, what we've seen is typically it's at least monthly inspections. What the SPCC rule does specify is how long you should be keeping those inspection documents. And as you can see here, you should have 36 months or 3 years worth of inspections available at your facility. So an EPA inspector or the CUPA inspector rolls up to your site, they should be able to review all the way up to 3 years prior your inspection documentation. Another big area is training. And what the SPCC rule specifies is annual review and discharge prevention briefings, and that training is provided to all personnel working around or with oil. The idea here is that you may have some pretty complex equipment associated with your facility to prevent discharges, and that you would need somebody trained on that equipment and trained on spill response procedures. So that's kind of the idea here. But as with anything that is done as infrequently as annually, it oftentimes falls off the radar. So watch out with those and make sure that you're scheduling and documenting your briefings, your training. Because again, the part that the inspector is going to look at when they come on site is, do you have your documentation associated with your training? Do you have the people signing off? Do you have the appropriate material covered and in the appropriate time frame? And as you can see here, it's very similar to the inspection documentation that you need to be keeping it around for 36 months, 3 years. So, hey guys, thanks for watching today. Hopefully you learned something new or got some good information about SPCC plans from the session. Don't forget to take the session quiz for credit. I've included a link here on this page. I've also included my contact information. This is the point in most of these types of presentations where I open it up to questions. Obviously, being digital and streaming, that's not really, possible. So like I said, feel free to reach out and shoot me an email or give me a call if you've got questions about SPCC plans. Thanks.